Let's bring the discussions home to what you call the streets of Lagos. The restrictions around the motorbike still causing a lot of conversations and upsets, as it were. Folks are trying to wrap their head around what this really mean, how long will it last, and a lot of emotional conversation around, so we understand how everyone is feeling the pinch of this new, what you call the implementation of an existing transportation or traffic law in Lagos State. Bolanle Agbaje is here from Financial Derivatives Company, and she wants to bring the thoughts at FDC to bear into this development. Thank you. It's good to have you back here since Tuesday. So, on Tuesday, this was on top of your burning economic issues on Tuesday, and you folks at FDC is also raising it again today. That means you folks have some thoughts on this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so the reason why it's still burning is because, you know, we've seen increased traffic around Lagos since Monday. Traffic has, you know, worsened. You have many individuals still complaining. And obviously it didn't come as a surprise to us with the Lagos state government because it was always part of their master plan. And, you know, they're trying to turn Lagos into a metropolitan, you know, city, just the way you have it in London. But I think what the only issue that we have with this new policy is the fact that obviously the government of Nigeria is more or less always using the shock therapy rather than gradualism when it comes to implementation of policies, in the sense that you needed to more or less put in those new buses in place to kind of, you know, offset the increased demand of transportation within Lagos, and obviously reduce the havoc that it would have caused, and not necessarily ban, you know, these Okadas before, you know, bringing in these buses. And obviously at the same time explain, you know, the travel routes to, you know, the average Nigerian. Because looking at VI, for example, in VI you have most of the working class population. Most times to commute within VI, most people don't necessarily use their cars. They more or less use the kekes or the Okadas just to, you know, go from
one point to another.
But, you know, that has obviously changed, and obviously it will create waste of time and less efficiency and productivity amongst workers. And you have obviously the increased robbery when it comes to, you know, certain areas on the mainland within Lagos. And, you know, what then happens to even those Okada drivers that have lost their jobs, that have families to feed? You know, what do they do with those displaced workers? So those are some of the issues that we try to wrap our head. But I think obviously these are short-term or temporary problems that would obviously happen, and I think the government is working hard to make sure that they're necessarily other alternatives in place to, you know, take over these problems.
Okay, so if we bring it home onto the consumer space here, which is one of the reasons we're having this conversation, is around how will this translate into what you folks thought could be some inflationary pressure, depending on how long these restrictions, and that's the way I put it, looking at what the government puts out, these restrictions are on what you call majorly commercial motorbike business within the city, and restricting motorcycles to a number of local governments and a number of areas. So,
so we definitely think, obviously, the Okada ban has more or less increased transport fares, you know, with alternative sources of transportation, and obviously they've taken advantage of it. You have an increased demand. As a bus driver, I'll more or less charge what I can obviously get from these desperate.
Yeah, reports say even Uber and Taxify
are taking advantage.
They're taking advantage, and they've raised their own service charge by as much as 100%, if not more.
Yeah, and you do understand where they come from, because obviously this has caused increased traffic, so they're burning more fuel, and obviously it takes them more time to get from one point to another.
I'm trying to understand this. I understand, and I see folks, dozens and hundreds, and numbers, dozens at the bus stops, but I just wanted the increase in number of vehicles, motor vehicles, which means that most of the folks we're talking about have those vehicles parked at home.
Well, yes, you obviously have a certain percentage
because if you say you restrict, where do all the vehicles suddenly come out from? Which means that previously a number of folks just park their vehicles at home
Yes.
and go by either keke marwa, which is a tricycle, or motorbikes. So as soon as this was effected on Monday, you suddenly find an upsurge. So which means that folks like you had vehicles at home. But when I see you in the title, it doesn't mean that you don't own a car.
No.
So this giving us another angle to the story on Okada ban, that a lot of folks are actually parking their cars at home. So that brings us to the conversation around having a smart city. And this all tells the story why we ought to have a metro rail in Lagos 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago before we arrive at this problem on our doorstep.
Yeah, so it's still back to what I was saying about the fact that there are no alternatives that are strong in place to kind of offset this ban in Okada.
So there could be inflation in terms of food prices, for example, because you can't move the bag of rice, and some folks still carry.
They're probably charging more to move that bag of rice from point A to point B, and those traders would obviously have to feed that into the final price of the commodities. But I think when you look at the general scope of things, we do expect that it would affect Lagos inflation, but not necessarily, national inflation.
Yeah, well, this is Lagos, because if you go to my 12 market and what have you, and you can move a basket of those also by keke mara because they're restricted, or motorcycle, or in that axis or whatever, then you will have to wait for regular bus, and those ones are charging higher.
Yes.
It's not going to feed into tomato prices. So let's just go there right now. It hasn't started yet, so don't start increasing the price of tomato or pepper out there, anyone in Lagos. Just hold on a little bit. I take us through the numbers. I just decided we should check that out today.
Yeah, so, well, prices have more or less, you have some that have remained stable, you have some that have increased, you have some that have, decreased, but this is feeding off from, January numbers. Obviously, these are going to change by next week as we see the impact of this new policies within Lagos. The price of palm oil has remained stable at 10,000.
You folks think as early as next week?
Well, some of the way these prices work, depending on the kind of policies being implemented, they directly affect, these traders. And these traders waste no time in feeding them into...
I understand, because this is an informal economy, largely.
Yes,
so it moves through informal means of transportation.
It does.
If you put Okada or keke marwa along that. So where do you think the first point of call will be? I'm sure the price of cement won't move up in Lagos.
No, I don't think the price.
So tomato, pepper,
rice, gari, beans. Those are some of the commodities that we
should be prepared for.
Yes, I think so, because these are commodities that move quickly. It's what you see on most Nigerians' tables, especially pepper and tomato is used daily within the Nigerian household. So we expect that to feed into the prices of these goods. Although the price of tomato and pepper are more or less around the same, 7,000 naira per bag for 50 kg bag. We do expect this to inch up marginally, but not so not that different, so that obviously the traders care about making sales, so I don't think they would increase prices to points where they can't even sell their bags.
You know the way things work in Nigeria, and just running this through my head is that, look, if you say, prices of tomato and pepper up in Lagos, then the folks bringing it to Lagos might just also say, hold on a second. If we are bringing this tomato from Kano, maybe we should just jack it up a little bit too.
Yeah.
So when we say Lagos, we might just end up having this inflation. Warm its way all the way up to Kano and elsewhere.
Yes, definitely. You do have the secondary effect of this, but I don't think the secondary effect would be that intense. Not just yet. Why? Because in January we definitely.
Let's change the conversation. I don't want us to give anyone ideas. People watch channel television
and
a
then
lot,
take
and they're just
advantage.
going to say, on channel television they say it's going to happen like this. So for those of you who are watching in Kano and elsewhere, don't listen to that part of the conversation. So let's talk about crude oil. Let's leave tomato and Okada and all that.
Yeah, we're still there with crude oil. There's mention from the OPEC meeting that they are, looking to cut, more likely looking to cut, or deepen cuts by about 500,000 barrels.
So we should be happy 54.17?
Well,
or at least we're rebounding.
Well, we're inching up marginally, and that's just because of the fact that OPEC is trying to do something. But we obviously have to think of the fact that OPEC, the only tool they have is to just cut supply. That's the only remedy they have. And what we've realized is at this point is very difficult to measure the cut in demand within China. So it's kind of, right now, OPEC is trying to find an equilibrium. And that equilibrium is going to be very difficult to find if you don't have, the numbers or the accurate numbers of the fall in demand within China. It's not very clear on what's, going on in China. We do understand that, some of the barrels of oil that were bought previously, some of the oil marketers in China are looking to resell these barrels of oil, and that's I think that would feed into prices, because that's not good news at the moment.
Okay, thank you so much, Bolanle Agbaje from Financial Derivatives Company. It's good to have you on Tuesday and here on Thursday, and we need to talk to you folks next week to see all that we've talked about, inflation and the especially in Lagos here. Yeah. This is Nigeria's economic and financial epicenter. Thank you so much, and have a great day. Let's take this a little bit, changing tack in about a minute.